If you could bring back dinosaurs, would you? And if you could, would you try to find out how they smelled, or whether they had morning breath, or what they ate for breakfast? Probably not. You'd probably want to know more dramatic things. Like, did they have feathers? How big were their brains? How fast could they run? But there's a lot more that ancient DNA can tell us about extinct species, including some of their more mundane habits. Hi, it's me, and this is Minute Earth. Scientists recently brought us some news that will change the way we think about one particular species of ancient bird. They learned that this extinct animal used tools. It's an amazing discovery, but maybe not in the way you're expecting. This bird was a Molamola, which lived on the island of Molola off the coast of Tanzania between 136,000 and 328,000 years ago. That's not so ancient. In fact, it was around when our ancestors started making cave paintings. Now, we know that birds use tools today. Like when New Caledonian crows use sticks to fish for termites. But this is the first time we've found evidence that a now extinct animal used tools. And it's surprising because these birds went extinct relatively recently. So why haven't we found evidence of them using tools before? Well, fossils don't preserve behaviors. We don't usually expect to find preserved poop or tools alongside fossilized bones. And this lack of evidence makes it hard to say which extinct animals used tools and when exactly tool use evolved. But this study was able to look at actual ancient DNA instead of just the preserved physical remains. The scientists extracted ancient DNA from a few fossilized Molamola bones, and then they tried to reconstruct the birds' genomes. To do this, they compared the genetic material to the genomes of living birds. They found that the Molamola genome was most similar to that of the white-throated laughing thrush, a small songbird that doesn't use tools. But the team also found genes related to the development of the avian telencephalon, the part of the brain that controls higher-order functions. Those genes were suspiciously similar to those in the genomes of New Caledonian crows and other tool-using birds. So even though the laughing thrush doesn't use tools, the researchers hypothesized that the Molamola might have done so because they shared more genetic material with tool-using birds than with other non-tool-using birds. They even found genetic changes that appeared to be adaptations specifically for using sticks. And this tells us that the Molamola were likely using tools in a way that's more complex than any behavior we've seen in birds today. Not only did they use tools, but they may have been better at it than living birds are. The scientists say that their findings are the strongest evidence yet for the idea that tool use in birds evolved independently multiple times. And that means that tool use may be more common than we think. These new findings also mean that we need to change our thinking about the behavior of extinct animals, especially ones that went extinct more recently. We usually reconstruct the behaviors of extinct creatures by looking at the behaviors of their closest living relatives. But that may not always be accurate, because it turns out that behavior can evolve faster than we think. So if we want to understand the behavior of a recently extinct animal, we should probably look beyond its closest relatives and instead consider the behavior of a much broader group of animals. In other words, if we want to understand how dinosaurs acted, we shouldn't just look at turtles and lizards, but we should take a broader approach that considers a wide variety of species. This new study helps us do just that, and it gives us an incredible window into the life of a recently extinct species. Take, for instance, a part of the genome linked to the development of feathers. The scientists found that the gene network in the Molamola was very similar to the one in the red junglefowl, a type of chicken. And that suggests that the Molamola were probably like chickens too. Chickens have flight feathers on their wings and tail, but they're not great at flying. Instead, they use their feathers for attracting mates. But then there's another part of their genome that looks like it's related to, you guessed it, tool use. And that suggests that the Molamola were probably like New Caledonian crows. And New Caledonian crows have strong claws and make tools for foraging. So we think that the Molamola spent their days searching for food using sticks. And thanks to this study, we can add one more detail to their story. They lived on an island. That may not sound surprising, given that we know that the Molamola lived on the island of Molokai. But it's actually a really important piece of information. Island-dwelling animals tend to have more complex brains than their mainland relatives do. And this is thought to be driven by natural selection. Islands often have lots of different kinds of resources and animals that specialize in exploiting those resources. That means there's more to pay attention to, and more ways to obtain food. And more types of animals can mean more predators. So island animals often need bigger brains to keep track of it all. But until now, we couldn't say that this pattern of brain evolution applied to recently extinct animals. But since the Molamola were island dwellers, this new study suggests that they likely had larger brains than their mainland relatives. And that makes sense, because the island of Molokai has been inhabited by hominins since about 2.6 million years ago. And hominins are the group that includes modern humans and our extinct relatives like Neanderthals. And hominins are known to have used stone tools. So our ancestors may have been both food and danger for the Molamola. So it's reasonable to assume that the Molamola needed bigger brains to survive. Not only does the study reveal insights about the size of the Molamola's brain, but they also showed that the shape of it changed too. Its relative brain size increased in a way that's more similar to the brain growth we see in primates than in other birds. Again, this makes sense considering that hominins were probably both predators and competitors for resources. And you'd expect a close relative of ours to have traits that help us survive. But interestingly, the team thinks that the changes in brain anatomy happened after the Molamola split from the laughing thrush, meaning that brain evolution isn't necessarily linked to behavior. There's probably a reason that hominins have bigger brains than other birds, but it's not that we use tools. Bigger brains may have helped the Molamola survive on an island with humans, but they didn't necessarily help them use tools. It seems like the relationship between genetics and behavior is super complex. We tend to think that genes control behavior, but really, it's more of a two-way relationship. Behavior can change genes, too. For example, if a behavior requires a certain adaptation, you won't see that behavior arise until that adaptation evolves. So even if two groups of animals share a behavior, like both using tools, that doesn't mean that they inherited that behavior from a common ancestor. It could mean that they evolved the same behavior independently. And that's something we're going to have to keep in mind as we move forward. As we learn more about the behavior of extinct species, we need to keep asking whether that behavior was inherited or evolved independently. Otherwise, we could end up with a distorted view of the history of life on Earth. We need to carefully untangle these complex relationships in order to get a clear picture of how the behavior of living and extinct animals evolved. And understanding those relationships will help us answer some pretty incredible questions. Like, did dinosaurs use tools? Who knows? Maybe someday we'll find evidence that they did, and we'll have to rewrite everything we thought we knew about their behavior. In the meantime, we have this incredible discovery of a bird that used tools and lived alongside humans and had a brain that grew in response. If we can keep uncovering secrets like these, who knows what else we'll learn about the world that's gone. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring this episode, and thank you for watching.